Marguerite Dubois had worked for the Conti family for 11 years before she ever saw the man who paid her salary raise his voice. Not when the stock market took a piece of his shipping business in 2008. Not when his youngest son wrapped a car around a guardrail and walked away without a scratch. Not even when a rival family's lawyer tried, and failed, to have him indicted on charges that quietly disappeared the way charges against men like him always seemed to. Vittorio Conti was, by every account anyone in that house could give, a controlled man, a careful man. The kind of man who measured his silences the way other men measured their words. Which is why, on a Tuesday afternoon in early October, when Marguerite found him standing frozen in the doorway of the nursery, staring at a small wooden box she had just pulled down from the top shelf of a closet while dusting, she knew immediately that she had made a mistake she couldn't take back. "Where did you find that?" Vittorio said. Not a question, a demand dressed up as one. Marguerite had been a nanny for the Conti children for over a decade. First for the two boys, now grown and gone, and for the past 4 years, for the youngest, a girl named Isabella who had just turned 7. She had raised 3 children in this house, and never once been shouted at, scolded, or made to feel unwelcome. She had also never, in 11 years, seen that particular closet opened, or known that box existed. "It was pushed all the way in the back, sir," she said carefully. "Behind some old coats. I wasn't looking for anything. I was just, give it to me." She did. Her hands were shaking slightly as she passed it over, though she couldn't have said exactly why. There was something about the way he held it, both hands, careful, the way you'd hold something that might shatter, or might detonate, and you genuinely weren't sure which. To understand what was inside that box, and why a man who had survived indictments, betrayals, and at least 2 attempts on his own life without visibly flinching would go pale at the sight of it, you have to go back nearly 40 years, to a different country, and a decision that had nothing to do with crime at all, at least, not at first. In 1985, a young man named Vittorio Conti was not yet the head of a criminal organization. He was 22 years old, working construction in a small town outside Palermo, engaged to a woman named Teresa Gallo, and about as far from the American mafia families his descendants would one day be associated with as a person could be. He was, by every measure that mattered in that village, an ordinary young man building an ordinary life. Sicily in the 1980s was not an easy place to build anything. The island was in the middle of what locals simply called the war, a brutal, sustained campaign of violence between rival organized crime factions, and eventually a broader war between the mafia and the Italian state itself, as prosecutors and judges began, for the first time in generations, actually trying to bring the organization down. People disappeared, judges were assassinated in broad daylight. Entire towns operated under a code of silence so absolute that speaking a name to the wrong person could get you or your family killed. Vittorio wanted none of it. He had watched his own father spend 30 years working for men who controlled the local economy through fear, and he had promised himself, the way young men in impossible situations often do, that his life would be different. It wasn't a promise the world was interested in letting him keep. Teresa was pregnant when the trouble found them, not because Vittorio had done anything, but because his older cousin, a low-level member of a local faction, had made an enemy of the wrong man and then made the fatal mistake of hiding in Vittorio's half-finished house while the police looked for him. The men who came looking weren't police. They didn't ask questions. They burned the house to send a message to anyone who might consider hiding a man like that again. Teresa didn't survive it. Vittorio did, badly burned, hospitalized for months, and left with a decision that would define the rest of his life. He could go to the authorities and testify against the men responsible, which in that place, at that time, was less a legal option than a slow method of suicide that would also endanger everyone he had left. Or he could do what an old family friend, a man with real connections in the organization, quietly suggested: leave the country, start over, and let the friend's cousin in America take care of him in exchange for loyalty. Vittorio chose survival. Most people, faced with that choice, would. What he didn't know, what almost nobody in his new life in America would ever know, was that Teresa hadn't died alone in that fire. She had been 7 months pregnant, and in the chaos and grief of that night, in a hospital overwhelmed with burn victims, and a system more concerned with covering up what had happened than documenting it accurately, a baby girl had been delivered early, premature, and quietly handed to a nun who ran an orphanage 2 towns over. Because nobody in the wreckage of that night had the presence of mind or the paperwork to connect a barely alive infant to a dying mother and a hospitalized father who wouldn't wake up for 6 days. By the time Vittorio was well enough to ask questions, he was told his fiancée and unborn child had both died in the fire. It was, in the strictest sense, what everyone around him believed to be true. Records from that chaotic year in Sicily were incomplete at best, and deliberately falsified at worst, and nobody had reason to look harder at a story that was, tragically, common enough to be believable without investigation. Vittorio Conti left Sicily believing he had lost everyone. He carried that grief to America, and he built an empire on top of it, the way a person sometimes builds an entire identity on top of a wound they never let heal, because stopping to feel it fully would mean stopping altogether. For nearly 4 decades, he never spoke of Teresa, not to his American wife, not to his sons, not to anyone in the organization he eventually came to lead. Grief, in that world, was treated the way weakness was treated, something to be buried so deep that even you forgot where you put it. The box Marguerite found contained the only physical trace of that life he'd allowed himself to keep. A single photograph of Teresa, a small gold locket that had been hers, and a letter, unfinished, unsent, written in Italian in handwriting that grew shakier toward the bottom of the page, addressed to a daughter Vittorio believed had died before she'd ever taken a breath. Marguerite didn't understand any of this yet. All she understood, standing in that doorway, was that she had accidentally uncovered something that had cost this powerful, controlled man the only visible cracks in his composure she had ever witnessed in 11 years of employment. She might have let it go entirely, might have simply apologized, backed out of the room, and never mentioned it again, the way any sensible employee in a house like that learns to do. But 3 weeks later, something happened that made silence impossible. Isabella, the youngest Conti child, came home from a class project about family trees with a homework assignment that required interviewing an older relative about their childhood. Innocently, unknowingly, she asked her father to tell her about his life in Sicily before he came to America. Vittorio, for the first time in Marguerite's 11 years in that house, couldn't answer. He simply excused himself from the dinner table and didn't come back down that night. It was Marguerite, sitting with Isabella afterward, helping her figure out how to complete an assignment her own father couldn't seem to speak about, who made a decision that would change everything. She had, in her years working for other families before the Contis, done informal genealogy work as a hobby, the kind of amateur research that had become popular with the rise of DNA testing services and digitized historical records. She had access to databases most people didn't think to use. And she had, sitting in the back of her mind for 3 weeks, an unshakable feeling that the grief she'd witnessed in that doorway was connected to something unresolved, not something finished. She started quietly, carefully, the way you approach a wound you're not sure you have permission to touch. Sicilian civil records from the 1980s. Orphanage intake logs, many of them still held by the Catholic Church, some digitized by historical societies researching that specific violent period. Hospital records from a fire that, she discovered, had been documented, briefly, incompletely, by a regional newspaper that no longer existed but whose archives had been preserved by a university. It took her 4 months of careful after-hours research to find the entry, an infant girl, admitted to a Catholic orphanage outside Palermo in 1985, no surviving family listed, given the name Sister Agnes had chosen for her because there was no one left to choose one, Maria. Maria had been adopted 2 years later by an Italian-Canadian couple and raised in Toronto. She would be 39 years old now, if she was still alive, working, according to a professional networking profile Marguerite found with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, as a pediatric nurse. Marguerite didn't go to Vittorio immediately. She understood, with an instinct that came from over a decade of reading this careful, controlled man better than almost anyone alive, that information like this delivered carelessly could do as much damage as the original loss. So she did something almost nobody in Vittorio Conti's professional life would have had the courage to do. She asked for a private meeting, sat across from the most powerful man she had ever worked for, and told him she believed his daughter might be alive. The silence that followed lasted almost a full minute. Marguerite would say later that she had genuinely, for the first time in 11 years, been afraid of what his reaction might be. Not because she thought he'd hurt her, but because she understood she was either about to give this man back a piece of his life he'd buried for 40 years, or destroy him with false hope built on incomplete records. It wasn't false. What followed over the next year wasn't the kind of instant, cinematic reunion audiences might expect. It was slower, more careful, and considerably more human than that. Vittorio, a man who had built his entire adult identity on controlling every variable in every room he ever walked into, had to learn to sit with something he couldn't control at all, whether a woman who had grown up as Maria Bertoli in Toronto, with parents she loved and a life she'd built without him, would want anything to do with the sudden reappearance of a biological father from a country and a past she barely knew existed. He hired the right people this time, grief counselors experienced in reunions between adoptees and biological family, a lawyer to handle things with total discretion and respect for Maria's existing family, and, at Marguerite's insistence, he wrote her a real letter this time, finished, instead of the one that had sat unsent in a box for 4 decades. It took 8 months before Maria agreed to meet him. It took another year before she started calling him anything other than Vittorio. She never called him Dad, that word, she told him gently but firmly, belonged to the man who'd actually raised her. And Vittorio, older and slower to anger than the man he'd been at 22, found he could accept that without it costing him anything. He didn't need the word. He needed the relationship, however it was shaped, however long it took to build. It changed him in ways that rippled quietly through the rest of his life. He began, without ever making an announcement about it, pulling back from parts of the organization's business that dealt in exactly the kind of violence that had taken Teresa from him in the first place. The kind that treated ordinary families as acceptable collateral damage in disputes that had nothing to do with them. He couldn't undo 40 years of an empire built a certain way overnight. But he stopped adding new chapters to it, built on the same foundation that had cost him everything once already. Marguerite kept her job. She also, quietly, became something closer to family than employee. The woman who'd had the courage to hand a broken man back a piece of himself he thought he'd lost forever, simply because she refused to look away from a grief she didn't fully understand, yet knew deserved to be taken seriously. The last time anyone saw that wooden box, it wasn't hidden in the back of a closet anymore. It sat on a shelf in Vittorio's study, the unfinished letter finally framed beside a new photograph. Vittorio, older now, silver at the temples, standing next to a woman with Teresa's exact same eyes, 40 years and an entire ocean between the daughter he lost and the woman who found her. Some secrets get buried because the people who bury them believe the pain is finished, settled, over. But every so often, someone brave enough to look closer, a nanny with a hobby for research, a child's innocent homework question, a box left slightly too far back on a shelf, proves that the story isn't finished at all. It's just been waiting, patiently, for someone willing to ask the right questions and refuse to stop when the answers got complicated.